Welcome back to Bonnie's Life. Today, we are diving into a story that sounds like pure science fiction, but I promise you, every single word of it is true. It is a story about life, death, and the terrifying space in between. It is a story about a woman who died in 1951, yet whose body is still alive today. In fact, there is more of her alive right now than there ever was when she was walking this earth. We are talking about immortality, not the kind you see in vampire movies or superhero comics, but real biological immortality. We are going to explore the profound philosophical paradox of what it means when your cells outlive you. If your cells live forever but you die, are you immortal? But this isn't just a philosophical debate. This is a story of profound medical exploitation, hidden truths, and a multi-billion-dollar industry built on the stolen flesh of a poor black tobacco farmer from Virginia. Her name was Henrietta Lacks, and the medical establishment tried very hard to make sure you only knew her as HeLa. Let's go back to the beginning. The year is 1920. Loretta Pleasant is born in Roanoke, Virginia. Her family isn't sure how her name changed to Henrietta, but they called her Henny. She was a beautiful African-American woman, remembered for her hazel eyes, her small waist, and the fact that she always wore red nail polish. When she was just 4 years old, her mother died giving birth to her 10th child. Her father couldn't cope, so he moved the family to Clover, Virginia, and distributed the children among relatives. Henrietta ended up living with her grandfather in a 2-story log cabin. And here is a detail that mainstream history often glosses over. That cabin was the former slave quarters on a plantation that had been owned by Henrietta's white great-grandfather. From an early age, she worked as a tobacco farmer. She fed the animals, tended the garden, and toiled in the fields. She had to drop out of school in the 6th grade to help support her family. She married her cousin, David Day Lacks, and they eventually moved to Maryland so Day could work at the Bethlehem steel plant. They had 5 children. They were poor, they worked hard, and they lived a quiet life. Then came 1951. Henrietta felt what she described as a knot in her womb. She went to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. Now, you have to understand the context of 1951 America. Maryland enforced strict Jim Crow laws. Black individuals were prohibited from attending the same schools or using the same hospitals as white people. Johns Hopkins was one of the only hospitals in the area that would treat poor black patients, but they treated them in segregated public wards. Dr. Howard Jones examined Henrietta and found a large purple glistening tumor on her cervix. He later described it as unlike any of the 1,000 or so carcinomas he had previously seen. He took a biopsy. Henrietta was diagnosed with a malignant cervical cancer. She was treated with radium tube inserts, which was the standard of care at the time. But here is where the story takes a dark turn. During her treatments, 2 samples were taken from Henrietta's cervix. One sample was of healthy tissue and the other was cancerous. These samples were taken entirely without her permission. They were taken without her knowledge. No one asked her. No one told her. Now, some will argue that at the time, taking tissue samples from patients without consent was common practice, especially for patients in public wards. But let's be clear about what that really means. It means that the medical establishment believed that treating poor black patients for free gave them the right to use those patients' bodies for research. It was seen as a form of payment. That is not consent, that is exploitation. The samples were given to Dr. George Otto Gey, a prominent cancer and virus researcher at Johns Hopkins. For years, Dr. Gey had been trying to grow human cells in his laboratory. He wanted to create an immortal cell line to study cancer. He had taken samples from hundreds of patients, but every single time, the cells would die within a few days. But Henrietta's cells were different. When Dr. Gey's assistant Mary Kubitschek put Henrietta's cells into a culture medium, they didn't die. They grew, and they grew fast. They doubled their number every 20 to 24 hours. They were unstoppable. Dr. Gey had finally found what he was looking for: the first immortal human cell line. He named them HeLa cells, taking the first 2 letters of Henrietta's first and last names. While her cells were thriving in a laboratory, Henrietta was dying in a hospital bed. The cancer had metastasized throughout her entire body. Her medical records described tumors covering almost every organ. On October 4, 1951, at the age of 31, Henrietta Lacks passed away. She was buried in an unmarked grave in her family's cemetery in Clover, Virginia. No headstone, no marker. Nothing to tell the world that the most important woman in the history of modern medicine was resting there. This is where the philosophical paradox begins. Henrietta Lacks, the mother, the wife, the woman who loved red nail polish, was dead. But her cells were alive, and they were about to change the world. To understand the magnitude of this, we have to talk about the science of aging and death. In normal human biology, there is something called the Hayflick limit. Discovered by Leonard Hayflick in the early 1960s, this limit dictates that a normal human cell can only divide about 40 to 60 times before it enters a phase called senescence, which is basically cellular aging, and then it dies. This happens because every time a cell divides, the protective caps at the ends of its chromosomes, called telomeres, get a little bit shorter. Think of them like the plastic tips on shoelaces. Every time the cell copies itself, those tips wear down a little more. When the telomeres get too short, the cell stops dividing. It is a biological clock ticking down to our inevitable mortality. But HeLa cells bypass the Hayflick limit. They possess an overactive version of an enzyme called telomerase. Telomerase constantly rebuilds those protective caps on the chromosomes. The telomeres never shorten. The biological clock is broken. The cells never age, and they never die. They are, by every biological definition, immortal. And here is the cruel irony. The very mechanism that made her cells immortal, the overactive telomerase, is the same mechanism that made her cancer so aggressive. The thing that killed Henrietta Lacks is the same thing that made her cells live forever. This raises a profound question. What does it truly mean to be immortal? For centuries, humanity has sought the fountain of youth, the elixir of life, the secret to living forever. We imagine immortality as a continuation of our consciousness, our memories, our experiences. But the immortality of Henrietta Lacks is something entirely different. It is a biological immortality, devoid of consciousness, devoid of the person who once inhabited those cells. When we look at HeLa cells under a microscope, we see life. We see cells dividing, consuming nutrients, and functioning perfectly, but we do not see Henrietta. We do not see the woman who loved her children, who worked the tobacco fields, who wore red nail polish. We see a biological machine, stripped of its humanity, reduced to a mere tool for scientific advancement. Henrietta's cells have been dividing continuously for over 75 years. It is estimated that if you gathered all the HeLa cells ever grown, they would weigh over 50 million metric tons. That is the equivalent of 100 Empire State Buildings. There are exponentially more of Henrietta's cells alive today than there ever were when she was a living, breathing human being. Her cells have been to outer space. They have survived nuclear radiation tests. They have crossed the Iron Curtain into Soviet laboratories. They exist on every continent on Earth. Some scientists have even argued that HeLa cells are no longer human at all. In 1991, evolutionary biologist Leigh Van Valen of the University of Chicago proposed that HeLa cells had evolved into an entirely new species, which he named Helaciton gatleri. His argument was fascinating. He pointed out that HeLa cells have a completely different ecological niche than humans. They live in petri dishes. They don't mate with humans. They reproduce asexually. And genetically, they are vastly different. While normal human cells have 46 chromosomes, HeLa cells have 82 due to the integration of the human papillomavirus that caused her cancer. Van Valen argued that HeLa cells made an evolutionary leap backward, from a complex multicellular organism to a single-celled microbe in just a few years. A transition that took nearly 3 billion years in one direction happened in reverse in just decades. If this is true, it means Henrietta Lacks didn't just provide cells for research, she inadvertently gave birth to a new species. So does this case prove immortality? In a strictly biological sense, yes. HeLa cells demonstrate that biological life can persist indefinitely when the mechanisms of aging are disabled. But in the human sense, the answer is far more complicated. The cells are alive, yet the person they came from is dead. They are immortal, yet they are not Henrietta. This is the paradox. Biological immortality is possible, but it is not the immortality we dream of. It is immortality without consciousness, without memory, without identity, and perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson of all. The same biological process that could theoretically make us immortal, activating telomerase to prevent aging, is also the hallmark of cancer. Our mortality, it turns out, may be the price we pay for not dying of cancer sooner. But let's step away from the philosophy and look at the cold, hard reality of what happened to these cells. Because while Henrietta's cells were achieving immortality, her family was living in poverty. The medical establishment quickly realized the value of HeLa cells. By 1952, just a year after Henrietta's death, a HeLa factory was established at the Tuskegee Institute. They were mass-producing her cells to test Jonas Salk's new polio vaccine. At its peak, this factory was shipping 20,000 tube cultures per week. And here is a bitter irony. This factory provided jobs for black individuals, but the research primarily benefited white polio sufferers. Furthermore, this was happening at the exact same institution that was conducting the infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where black men were deliberately left untreated for syphilis, so doctors could study the disease. HeLa cells became the gold standard for medical research. They were mailed to scientists all over the globe. They went to space with NASA in 1964 to test the effects of zero gravity. They were used to study the effects of radiation from nuclear bombs. They were crucial in developing vaccines for HPV and COVID-19. They helped map the human genome. They were the first human cells ever cloned. Research using HeLa cells has contributed to 3 Nobel Prizes, over 100,000 scientific publications, and more than 11,000 patents. And they generated billions of dollars. Companies like the American Type Culture Collection began selling vials of HeLa cells. Today, HeLa cells can sell for over $2,000 per milliliter. Biotech giants like Thermo Fisher Scientific built massive empires. Partly on the back of HeLa cell research, Thermo Fisher reported over $42 billion in revenue in 2024 alone. Novartis used HeLa cells to develop and test its antiviral drug Famvia, which generated billions in revenue. And yet, for decades, the Lacks family didn't see a single cent. In fact, they didn't even know the cells existed. It wasn't until 1975, 24 years after Henrietta's death, that the family accidentally found out about HeLa cells during a chance conversation at a dinner party. Imagine that. Imagine finding out that a piece of your mother, who you thought had been resting in peace for 2 decades, was actually alive and being bought and sold around the world. And how did the medical establishment treat the family once they found out? With shocking callousness. In the 1970s, researchers realized that HeLa cells were so aggressive, they were contaminating other cell cultures in labs worldwide. They were like a laboratory weed, as scientists called them. To figure out which cells were HeLa, they needed genetic markers from Henrietta's immediate family. So, Johns Hopkins doctors contacted the Lacks family and asked for blood samples. But they didn't tell the family why. They misled them, telling them they were testing them to see if they had the same cancer that killed Henrietta. The family, terrified of the disease that took their mother, complied. Once the researchers got the blood they needed, they ghosted the family. No follow-up, no explanation, nothing. The exploitation didn't stop there. In the 1980s, the family's medical records were published without their consent. In 2013, researchers published the entire DNA sequence of the HeLa genome online, completely ignoring the privacy implications for Henrietta's living descendants. Anyone could download the genetic blueprint of the Lacks family. It was only after the family protested that the National Institutes of Health finally agreed to give them some control over access to the genome. Perhaps the most horrifying chapter in this story involves a doctor named Chester Southam. In the 1950s, Southam wanted to know if cancer could be transmitted. So, he took live HeLa cells and injected them into patients. He injected them into cancer patients, healthy individuals, and prison inmates at the Ohio State Penitentiary. He didn't tell them he was injecting them with malignant cancer cells. He told them he was testing their immune systems. Within days, aggressive tumors began growing on the patient's arms. When Southam was finally caught and tried for what many compared to the medical war crimes of the Holocaust, he was found guilty of fraud and unprofessional conduct. His punishment? a 1-year probation. That is how little the medical establishment valued the lives and consent of the people they experimented on. For decades, the Lacks family lived in poverty. Henrietta's children suffered abuse, food insecurity, and incarceration. They couldn't even afford health insurance, while the sales of their mother were generating billions of dollars for pharmaceutical companies. Deborah Lacks, Henrietta's daughter, spent her entire life trying to learn about her mother, only to be met with silence and dismissal from the medical community. It wasn't until very recently that the family began to see any form of justice. In October 2021, the estate of Henrietta Lacks, represented by civil rights attorney Ben Crump, filed a lawsuit against Thermo Fisher Scientific. They accused the company of unjustly profiting from Henrietta's stolen cells. In July 2023, Thermo Fisher finally settled with the family. The exact terms are officially undisclosed, but it was reported to be around $9.9 million. In February 2026, the family reached another settlement with the Swiss pharmaceutical giant Novartis. Lawsuits against other companies are still ongoing. But let's put that in perspective. A $9.9 million settlement from a company that makes $42 billion a year. The CEO of Thermo Fisher made over $26 million in compensation in a single year. That means the CEO's annual paycheck was nearly 3 times the entire settlement the family received for 75 years of exploitation. So, what do we take away from the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks? Scientifically, HeLa cells have saved millions of lives. They are the foundation of modern medicine. But philosophically and ethically, they represent a profound failure of humanity. The case forces us to confront the paradox of mortality. Henrietta Lacks died, but her cells achieved the immortality that humans have dreamed of for millennia. Yet that immortality came at the cost of her bodily autonomy, her privacy, and her family's peace. It proves that biological immortality is possible, but it also shows us that immortality without humanity is just a product to be bought and sold. The discovery of how HeLa cells bypass the Hayflick limit has profound implications for our understanding of aging. If we can understand how telomerase prevents cellular death, could we potentially apply that knowledge to human aging? Could we develop therapies that extend human lifespan? These are tantalizing possibilities, but they also raise profound ethical questions. If we could achieve biological immortality, who would have access to it? Would it be available to everyone, or only to the wealthy and privileged? The story of Henrietta Lacks already answers that question. The benefits of her immortality went to corporations and the privileged, while her own family couldn't afford basic health care. The story also serves as a stark reminder that the history of medicine is deeply intertwined with the exploitation of marginalized people. The breakthroughs we benefit from today were often built on the suffering of those who were denied basic human rights and dignity. Henrietta Lacks was not just a cell line. She was a mother, she was a wife, she was a woman who loved her family, who wore red nail polish, who worked the tobacco fields of Virginia. Her cells may be immortal, but it is our responsibility to ensure that her humanity and the truth of how she was treated is never forgotten. Because true immortality is not just about living forever. It is about how we are remembered. It is about the legacy we leave behind. And the legacy of Henrietta Lacks should not just be a story of scientific triumph, but a story of resilience, of justice, and of the enduring power of the human spirit. If you found this episode thought-provoking, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. What are your thoughts on the ethics of HeLa cells? Do you think the family has received adequate justice? Does this case prove that immortality is possible? Or does it prove that immortality without consciousness is meaningless? Let's discuss it in the comments. And as always, keep questioning the world around you. This is Bonnie, signing off.